I just need time to be slow and to think things through. That's all. That's it.
20-minute episode. We've got this.
No, this is not going to be 20-minute episode. No. No.
Oh Lord.
All right. Okay,
totally fine.
Let's get started. I think this will be good content, by the way. What we need to say anyhow, like I said in the audio message to Jess. I'll get started with the intro.
Yeah.
Welcome to What's Left, the weekly political discussion challenging the mainstream left. I'm Eduardo Barca with co-host, teacher and socialist Andy Lipson, and writer and teacher Jessica. We're online at whatsleftpodcast.com. You can find that link to our blog in the episode notes. You can also find our personal social media handles as @Don Eduardo Barca and @ZepTK for Kenny Cepeda's account, who is currently on sabbatical. And that's the Instagram account, and for Jess's Twitter handle @jhomie89. Please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications, and share your favorite episode where you found this episode. And one other note, you can find our swagger, our shirts. If you would like a shirt of What's Left, in the episode notes, we did an episode last week on shirts, and you can check that out in the episode notes below with the link to it. Thank you. All right. So we're discussing today transgenderism. Yes. I think this is something that we've kind of talked about on and off, another offline. I don't know. I think I may have had some hesitancy around it. And but you really pushed for it this week, Andy. So why don't you start it off, since you pushed for it this week? And I was not content with that.
Well, I've wanted to have this conversation for some time, almost for a year, really, maybe even later than that, since we had that episode where we posited the notion of what is the connection between the transgender movement and the ruling class push for transhumanism and the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And Jake was on that episode, and what came out of that, I felt, was a difference between myself and Jessica, and I would frame as her framing it as like the transgender movement is not really a movement; it's a push by the elites or ruling class for a transhumanist agenda, and it's an ideological shaping operation. It's part of a Psyop almost. That's how I heard it, at least. So she's really going to say what she's really about today, so that's fine. But I've wanted to really get more deeper into that because I don't think I agree with that. I can see elements of that, but I don't think that is a full characterization of what I think is going on in relationship to people who may want to change their gender, whether that be in all sorts of different ways. So I can understand why they might want to do that. So, and I think they've been an oppressed group. So anyway, this is a conversation I've wanted to get into so we can just sort of see where we're at. And I think it is a question for the freedom, liberty, fighting the transhumanist agenda, fighting the Fourth Industrial Revolution, because I think there are, in my opinion, most people in that movement, whether they hail historically from the left or from the right, have largely taken the idea that the transgender movement isn't a movement, and that it's something, in some ways, it's a set of ideas to be fought against. That's how I hear it, at least. So I want to see if we're on the same page here.
Jess, did you want to add anything to it?
No, go ahead.
So when we decided to do this, I called you. I spoke to you, Andy, and I said I had some hesitancy because I feel as if I shared with Jess and both of you podcasts on my viewpoint as a Mexican on trans issues, the way I see it culturally, different from identity politics in the USA. It still overlaps because obviously I still feel there are left-leaning ideologies in my mind about how I see this. And as I listen to Jess's resource on YouTube that what she shared on with, I forget her name at this moment.
You're talking about the Jennifer Bilek interview that I saw from the 11th Hour blog?
Yes, Jennifer Bilek, that's right. And so I was listening to it, and as I was listening to it, I realized that I was feeling just the same way, in the way that the interviewer was saying that it's hard to escape sort of the left-leaning ideology around this. It's everywhere, and you're going to be it's hard to think outside of how you've been influenced. And so I will do my best, but I also feel like I have personal experiences that are to me important, my relationships to begin with, and I have also talked about sex work on What's Left, and that also is influential. And lastly, I also think that it's important that I just acknowledge that I'm not going to be, I'm still evolving around certain issues. So I'll be thinking about this, and also maybe take on a position differently than what I did before. So that's also important to note.
I'm not sure I have a whole lot to add in terms of framing. I mean, yeah, we talked about this issue. I mean, we've talked about it off air, off and on, but yeah, I don't know, just thinking back to when we actually did the episode on it a year ago, I think I was like, I got pretty frustrated, honestly, during that episode, because I think it was probably the most, not surprised, but yeah, I mean, we disagree, like the four of us, you know, Kenny included, like we've definitely had plenty of differences of opinion on different things, but I think that for me, since I've joined What's Left, was like the biggest, like, whoa, okay, there is like a huge divide in how we're seeing reality. And yeah, it'll be interesting to see. Like, I'm really curious what you just said, Eduardo, like how you might have shifted a little bit in, you know, however that's manifesting. Yeah, I don't know. I'm gonna try to not like walk on eggshells because I think I'm more comfortable with you than I was a year ago. And I also, like I was saying before we hit record, like I'm kind of tired too, and like impatient of, not with you guys, but just of having this conversation about what to me feels like the most obvious, like basic realities of being human in the world. And I mean, the only thing I can kind of relate that experience to is that feeling like at the beginning of COVID, when you were talking to people and suddenly like there's just this rift of like, oh my God, like these people aren't even in the same, like they're not living in the same reality. They're not living in the same paradigm as I am. And how do you navigate that? Right. Like, it's not just like a little like, oh, we're going to hash this out, like whatever. So yeah, it is a huge, for me, like it's such a huge, transgender ideology is such a huge, what's the right word? Arm of the fourth industrial revolution in my mind, that it feels like big for me. Like we're walking around town, the four of us, with t-shirts that say we're against the fourth industrial revolution. So it's like, yeah, I feel like this issue is like it. I would like to be, I don't know, I feel like we need to be clear, even if we're disagreeing. I want to be clear about like, what does that mean?
So I invite listeners and viewers to listen/view the two episodes of I forget the presenters or the YouTuber's channel's name of what Jess shared with me, and she will have the links below for the episode in the episode notes, because that's what I really did appreciate from Jess when I asked her what I needed. And those episodes were different from what I'm used to hearing about, or any anti-trans, or however someone else might frame it. But normally when I hear something around, I'll just say anti-trans for now. You could say it differently, but I'll just say anything that around anti-trans discourse, I hear religion in it underneath. And I have a big trigger around religion because it's all just, it's based on someone's belief, and it's not based on like how I can talk about it with other people who don't share the same beliefs. So for me, the issue, and I get triggered, I was raised in left-leaning environments, but raised a conservative. I've already shared in this episode that I was raised a Jehovah's Witness, but I was raised in environments that were very left-leaning. So Mexico City is very left-leaning, has had same-sex marriage before the USA did. And I was also in San Francisco, and I've gone to Europe as adolescent, and Paris is obviously very left-leaning. Amsterdam, so much so. So even though I was raised conservative, I have very left-leaning ideology surrounding me all the time. So most of that rhetoric, most of the people that are talking about trans issues or anti-trans issues, they are talking in terms of God, and I just completely just dismiss. Immediately, my dismissal is, you know what? Like I don't have any. There isn't much we can discuss except that you're basing it off of God, and that depends on individuals. Like I can't really say much to that. So you're wrong, in my head. That I'm sorry for anyone that might get offended to that. If anyone's listening to that, and you might be religious, but it just doesn't have any substance for me. The episodes that I listened to that Jess shared with me were very different. We're not around God and religion. At least not everything that I heard of. Not every, like I didn't hear anything that was support. It was really, it was good. It was a very good argument. And I will say that there are certain things that I'm disagreeing and agreeing. Here's what I feel I agree with. There are differences between men and women. For me, there are differences. Biologically, I'm not able to. I was born with a penis. I was born with and I consider myself to be a man, and I understand that I will never have the experience that, if I may use you as an example, Jess, or you can tell me otherwise, I will never be able to reproduce and have for 9 months or however many months to be able to procreate and to have a child and to give labor. I just won't be able to have that. And there are also hormonal differences. I understand that very well. That this I agree with. I'm not into this whole ideology on the left that we're just simply not different at all. There's no differences at all, which is what I hear constantly in the left-leaning media, and I hear in like university kind of academia. So I do think that hormones do have a factor in the way that you think, in the way that you perform, including food. All of that takes into account. So I do think there incremental or even strong chemical changes in differences between men and women. That's my belief. I've had this discussion with my friend Jake, who's also had this discussion, and he says, like, you know what, the left is trying to blur the lines. There is no blurring. It's straight up left. It's women and men. Where I think that it gets tricky is that there's a small percentage, and there are people who are intersex, and they have both genitalia, and they are also influenced by the chemicals that it's being in their hormonal changes. But there's no it's not as binary as we can say. So that's my personal sense. The second point, to this to the episode that were shared with me, I wasn't very aware that there are corporate agendas trying to monopolize the trans movement. There were names that were mentioned. I didn't have time to look at every other like the corporatization and the names that were given of individuals that are, quote, I'll just use their what do you call it? Autogenic? What's the word?
Autogynephilic.
Autogynephilic. Yeah, from people who have who are backing those kind of movements. I'm not as aware, and I now am because of those by Jennifer Bilek. Bilek, is that right, Jess? Where I differ here is that I believe if you look at, like, I took some courses on in sexuality, anthropology courses on sexuality. I think that sexuality is one of the areas of humans that is very complex, And I think that there have been so many indigenous cultures with this, what I'll just use for conventional use, third gender. So I think that there has always been historically in our cultures as humans, different, not just in same-sex relationships, but also people who have taken on masculine or representative, what do you call it? They've just switched to the other gender for their societal sake. For example, in Alaska, the Inuits would, if they had daughters and they wouldn't have a male firstborn, or not even a male, then for their family and for their to be able to take care of their family, they would have to marry off the firstborn female and perform as a man, have to take male duties and get married with another female. And so that's before like this whole trans issues that I think that have been more prominent since the 80s, which more so gay issues, but like have recently been. So this is prior to corporatist movements co-opting the trans movement. So I do think that that's an example of how even in Mexico, for example, Mushes in Oaxaca, there are biological men who have take on the status or the gender role of a woman in the society, and they're quite accepted in indigenous culture. So these are just some of the examples. There's so much more that I had in my mind that I could share, and I don't want to take up too much time right now, but that I feel that has transcend, like way before, it has always been around. And so I'm curious, and this is where I'm going to ask you, Jess, like, where does that fit in like feminist movements? Like that is how also I feel would be the question, like human sexuality, gender roles are all kind of complex topics for it just to be sort of like, all right, well, we should just stick maybe just to women and men having their distinct roles, and that's how it should be. So the third point I also wanted to talk, the point I was going to say was, I feel as if there isn't anything, me personally, I don't know if I have any qualms with people dressing or undressing in what society is considering what is masculine or feminine representations of what women and men are. Like, I don't really care if people want to dress as women or women want to dress as men according to our current societal standards of what that means. I believe in civil liberties, and I just don't care what people do in their private lives. I understand that everything trickles down, and I know that as this episode that was being shared with me by Jennifer Bilek, girls are very vulnerable. I agree with that, very vulnerable. And they could potentially be influenced to, as like already on top of their insecurities with social media, as well as women constantly being objectified. The influences of what adults do with their lives are definitely going to trickle down to what kids and minors think about what is also maybe comfortable for them instead of being objectified as women. And they might want to take on a male role because that's safer. So I understand that part. I still, though, stand for civil liberties. And I think that people should, I think this whole legislation around what people do, what can and cannot do, is just going to be a way to control us further. I've had this discussion around drugs and also around, we've talked about it with masks and vaccine mandates and all this. And I just think any sort of legislation to control what people can and cannot do is a way in to control ultimately every bit of our lives, even our sexual lives. So those are the main points that I think I'll just mention, and then we can, anything that I'll think about to bring up, I'll say it.
I feel like there's a lot, so I'm probably going to miss stuff. So if I don't answer something that you wanted me to answer at any point, Eduardo, just let me know. I'm
sorry. Yeah.
Reminded. But I guess, let's see where to start. I mean, I think maybe just the language for me is like a good place.
Do you notice how I'm stuttering or stumbling upon how to frame this stuff? Is that
No, I think you did a good job outlining some of your like stance and some of the questions you have and some of like the complications as you see it. I'm not talking about your language. I'm just talking about like the terms that we're using, because this is what I mean when I felt like when we did the other episode, like it's not that I mean, I stand by everything I said a year ago, but I feel like we fall into this trap. And one of the reasons I wanted to send you Jennifer Bilek's work in particular is because I think she is so good at being crystal clear with the language. Right? And I think like even people like me who literally think the entire gender ideology thing is complete BS, we like fall into this pattern of like using the same terms. Like what is transgender, or even like let's even take transgender off the table for a sec. Like what does gender even mean? Like because I think we're all kind of talking about slightly different things. Like are we talking about how you dress? Are we talking about like prescribed cultural gender roles? Like it becomes so cyclical with the language of like, well, having a gender identity means how you identify in terms of your gender. Like, you just keep going in circles. And so, yeah, I mean, to me, like, trans, it's not, well, okay. So trans, what we're now saying transgender, the mainstream, that as a mainstream term, honestly is pretty recent as I understand it. Like, I'm not saying the word didn't exist, but right, a few decades back, it was transsexual or transvestite. Okay, so transvestite literally means trans, right, across or through or whatever, and then vest coming from, I think it's like vestire. It's been a while since I've taken Latin, right? But it's clothing, to clothe. So you're talking about somebody, typically a male, an adult male, who likes to dress in quote unquote women's clothing, right? Dresses or whatever. Now, I completely agree with you, Eduardo. I don't give a fuck what people want to wear. If a man wants to wear a dress, great. I wear pants all the time, right? Like, it's fine. I don't give a shit. Now, I think transvestite, right, where that is what I would call, in most cases, like a kind of sexual. It's not just like a guy wants to wear a dress to work. It's typically a sexual fetish, right? Of like being aroused by the image or the idea of yourself like dressed up in quote unquote women's clothing. So transvestite and then transsexual, right? There we're talking about the notion of changing your sex, which is impossible.
That's how I understand it too.
This is it's not possible. Like you can have a million surgeries, you can take all the hormones in the world. It's not possible to change your sex. You can want whatever you want. Of course, there are many people who, for a wide variety of reasons, are unhappy in the body that they're in. I have no problem if people think they are a different sex, if they think they were born in the wrong body. I think that's sad. I think that speaks to a culture which pushes like disembodiment and pushes people to feel inadequate and pushes people to make choices that I think in a healthy society they wouldn't make. And are they really choices? I don't know. We can get into that. But it's transsexual, like that doesn't exist. Now the word transgender has basically in the mainstream dialogue, at least in my experience, kind of replaced transsexual to the point where transsexual and transvestite has almost become a little bit of a slur in a lot of contexts.
Yeah, it has. Transsexual is a slur.
Yeah, and I mean, somebody tell me, like, what is gender? Like, what do you when you guys are saying somebody's transgender or even just gender in general? Like, are you talking about what is that? How do you define it?
Well, I mean, I could take a shot at it. The way I understand.
I'm like genuinely curious, like, because I
Well,
don't have understood for it.
So again, as I said in the beginning, I've been influenced by left-leaning ideology. So I'll just use what I understood as in what I've studied in school and what I was taught. Gender, according to my upbringing, and it is that gender is more what someone thinks or feels or is experiencing in their body or their mind, different from what may or may not align with their physical, sexual, reproductive organ.
Right. And people can feel however they want. People can call themselves whatever name or nickname they want, right? But like fundamentally, in terms of material reality, you are the sex that you were born in. And yeah, I hear like there's a very, 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 very small number of people who are intersex, but that's a material reality. Like and those people aren't necessarily like, they don't even necessarily like identify as trans. I mean, maybe some of them do. I've met one person in my adulthood who like, and actually had, full on conversations, who was intersex. But that's not like, oh, I'm identifying outside of this binary. It's like they were born with, and there's variations, right, in terms of like what that actually looks like on a, in terms of genitalia and such. But by and large, like.
But I have a question, I guess, Jess. I mean, I think and not just academia influence, but also having been involved in and out of LGBTQ, and what was interesting from Jennifer Bilek also discussing those acronyms, which I'll get into, being out and being pushed out because of who I am as passing for heterosexual, sometimes because I'm in heterosexual relationships. My understanding is from folks in the community is that it's not just something that they just randomly feel, or it's not just, it is a dysphoria that is innate since their childhood. I have had friends who have not regretted their sex change. I know that you've talked about there is no such thing as transsexual, and I agree that there's no such thing as you being able to have a female reproductive system. Yes, I agree with that. But just for conventional use and for this conversation, so we're not lost in the terms, or constantly trying to describe what, anti-transsexual and what's not transsexual and whatever. What they feel and what like I feel as a man, like I can't necessarily describe, right? Like I can't describe how I've always felt like a man. I don't know, like it's new. And that's when because they turn it on me, and that's what they say in turn. It is what I've always known. I've just always, how do I deal with the psychological impacts of how I'm constantly in disaccord with my body? I'm not able to. So that's the response. And I know you've heard this. You work in academic circles. I know I'm not giving you new information. I'm just, for the sake of the audience and everything, I would like to know what is your response to that, what is when they say that?
Yeah. So I guess two things. One, I don't know if I misunderstood the beginning of what you said, because you brought up like you being like heterosexual passing. And I think we should get into this more, the LGB, right? And then the T, because to me, this is like, and it's a lot of like, this is what sort of liberalism has done in the past couple of decades, is they've hitched something that is not your sexual, like, yeah, you can be straight, you can be gay, you can be bisexual, right? We pretty much covered all the bases there, right? There's no more letters to add. This notion of trans, right, is something else. It's not your sexual orientation, who you're attracted to, right? Mm-hmm. So even that in and of itself, and I really want to get into at some point the deeply ingrained homophobia in gender ideology, because I think this is like a huge um like it's supposed to, like, it's framed as like, oh, it's liberal, like it's supporting gender ideology, transgender rights, quote unquote, is liberal. And it's part of, like, you know, the pride parade, right? And
Yeah.
even like we could even talk about it in terms of that podcast you sent, because I think there's some really interesting comments in that about like growing up in a homophobic society, right? But to address your question about the dysphoria, right? Um, I'm not saying people don't have dysphoria, like, at all. I think there's a few different kind of arms of, I mean, a few different, like, I mean, I don't like to put people in boxes, but I think there's patterns, right, that we see with this, especially in the older generations. And I think we talked about this last time. Um, it was much, the prevalence was uh, biological males thinking that they were women, or wanting to become women, wanting to, you know, dressing, you know, whether as transvestites or whatever. It was predominantly, you know, as they say, like male to female transitions. Now you have this insane wave of young girls, some of them like very, very young, uh, interested in quote unquote transitioning, actually medically transitioning, identifying, whatever, the whole gambit, right? There's a huge range of like different steps that people take, in varying degrees of insanity, in my opinion. But so you have autogynephiles, which you brought up, right? So that's
Mhm.
one group of people who, you know, quote unquote, identify as transgender. And those are men who are turned on by the idea of themselves as a woman. It's a sexual
Mhm.
fetish, right? You have what I would argue is largely social contagion in a sector, especially the young girls that I'm talking about. That's like what people like Abigail Schreier, who got, you know, this huge, lots and lots of attention, um, and censorship and stuff in the media for her book Irreversible Damage, which looks specifically at the transgender, I think she calls it like the transgender craze that's seducing young girls. So there you have an element of cultural conditioning, social manipulation, right? Like I don't think that's sexual fetish. I think that's something else. Um, and some, you know, I mean, a lot of children are dysphoric, like a lot, of girls and boys at a very, very young age do, express this dysphoria that they feel, you know, they feel like they're in the wrong body. The majority of those people, and there's scientific studies to back this up, just naturally grow out of it, right? It's part of the growing up process. A small subsection don't, and I'm guessing those are the people that you're talking about who say like don't regret quote unquote transitioning. Um, and I mean, I have no. This should be clear, but like it's not. I don't like hate anybody, or I don't want to deny anybody human rights. Um, I don't care. Like I don't care how. I mean, I care, but like I'm not interested in controlling how people identify, what they do in their bedroom, as long as they're not hurting anyone. Even, I mean, to some extent, given the circumstances of our current reality, what drugs they take and what body parts they choose to uh, butcher.
Mutate us.
Yeah. I mean, I have a problem with the surgeons. I have a problem with
Mm,
the medical system that's
I
just
agree. Yeah.
drugs and all of that. But I don't, I'm for bodily autonomy. I'm for freedom of thought. Um, but what I'm not for is institutionalizing this. And I'm not for mandating that other people participate in a fantasy, or in some cases participate in someone's sexual fetish. Like, and I'm not trying to be mean about it, right? Like, this comes up all the time with like the fucking pronoun issue, right? Of like, well, why can't you just do us like this small common decency? Like, what do you lose, right? But to use incorrect pronouns, right, is to ask somebody to participate in a reality that isn't, like, it's to deny what I know to be true, right? And I think too, like, there's, every time I come up into one of these like arguments with usually liberals, you know, that like, oh yeah, like you're just like a bigoted TERF or whatever, and like, yeah, okay, like, yeah, maybe like one woman got raped in a prison, right, because of the gender ID laws changing, or like maybe yeah, maybe this one group of feminists got censored, or whatever it may be, and it's getting bigger and it's getting bigger and it's getting bigger. And it's, to me, it's like, I don't, like, where is the line? Like, how many women in a women's prison need to be raped for us to say, okay, like this is crossed the line?
So I've enjoyed listening to you both kind of talk, and there's definitely some things that Eduardo said that I'll probably amplify, and there's some things I do agree with you on, Jessica, particularly the pronoun discussion, like the idea that one group who says you must use this can just impose it without understanding there has to be a dialogue. Like, there's going to have to be a dialogue from people who don't actually share the same beliefs. It's like atheists organizing with Christians. If they're going to do that, they're going to have some way, if they want to do that and actually fight for a better world together, they're going to have to figure out how to understand each other, which means there's going to be some differences they're going to have to work through. And I do believe that there's been a way that this stuff has been bullied, but again, I'm not surprised by that, because I believe that the ruling class is using an issue, and I would say using an oppressed group against all of us. So the first thing I'll say, regardless of agreement or disagreement, is yesterday me and Randy went to a Wisdom Warriors meeting where a guy talked at length about the tech attack that we are under, the fourth industrial revolution tech attack that we are under. But his starting point for when, and I really liked what he had to say, or at least I liked the information he had to give us about how fucked we are in terms of how deeply penetrated the digital world already is into a surveillance apparatus that we're already trapped in. And it was very helpful to hear. But his starting point was the idea that he understood how deeply screwed we are. His starting point is they are using immigrants, allowing immigrants to come across the border to do all this stuff. Like, and secondly, that all of this is part of a communist plot, communist takeover, communitarian communist to institute essentially communism, our rulers to institute communism on us. And so we have to fight that. We have to fight and basically preserve the idea of the American Constitution and the freedoms and liberties that were and kind of first given to us by the American Revolution. So I don't agree with the starting point of any of what that guy's talking about. So we have a big disagreement there as it relates to open borders. And I certainly don't agree with that this is a communist attack, because I'm a communist and I think fighting for working class democracy is going to be one of the ways that we do this. And lastly, I don't think the American Revolution is anything other than the establishment of a new dictatorship. So that's nothing. And me and Brady don't agree on that, but I don't agree with this guy on that as well. But that does not preclude me from seeing that he is going to be a comrade in this fight. But we're going to have some differences along the way that are going to have to be worked out. And so that's my starting point for talking about even this conversation. And if I was organizing with that guy, that is going to be a long road we're going to have to get through to be able to have a deeper understanding that even me and Jake, I think, have a deeper understanding, even though he ain't a communist, but he understands more deeply where I come from when I talk about communism. And I don't think he believes in open borders, I don't think, but he understands why I say that. So let me just say some of the areas that I don't. So first off, I do believe, whether people were calling themselves transvestites or then transsexual or now transgender, I believe those people who are going through that are an oppressed group. Meaning that they are marginalized by virtue of being told you can or can't do certain things. And if you try to do certain things, you're going to be shamed for doing them. That was true, I believe, for transvestites, men who dressed as women or wanted to dress as women. And I think it's true in terms of the difficulties that people who haven't ever, if a person now says that they are so deeply alienated from their own sense of what they've been told their gender is when they grew up, and I am partially talking about not just intersex, but even a person who doesn't constitute intersex when there's some sort of XXY kind of genetic makeup there or anything like that. I even mean for a person who was told, I've been told I was a girl, but I don't feel that way. I feel like I'm a boy. And for that person, what is now available to them, it is possible. And I think, Jessica, you said, no, you can't. I'm not sure I agree with that, particularly if you say that what will make a woman is, say, reproduction, or what will make a woman a woman. I'm not saying you said that, but people may have to make these determinations. What will make a woman is a certain chromosomes. And for me, I guess I would just say, it should be a simple question, man, woman. But we live in an oppressive society. We live in a capitalist society, which uses oppression to divide people and to control people. And so gender roles and gender itself has been politicized and has been weaponized, I would say, of course, against women, but also against men. And so it's not going to be, to me, it's not going to be a simple answer is to say, you are a woman, you are a woman and you can't become a man, or you are a man and you can't become a woman. Again, particularly because those then become political labels that are decided by a society that rises above us, that where it says on your ID, you can do this. And being a woman and being a man gives you certain rights. Well, that's in a society that's a dictatorship in the first place. So all of these things under a dictatorship, which is what we live in, all of these things are highly politicized and highly polarized intentionally by the ruling class. So if I imagine these things, the ruling class taken out, if I imagine capitalism gone, this question for me of, does it matter about women and men? Does it matter who if a person calls himself a woman and isn't or wasn't when they were born, but now we're calling them? I would say in a free society, I personally don't think those things matter. And that's my standing point for, like, and maybe this is where Jessica, you and I agree. People have bodily autonomy. People are free to decide what they will. And that's how I feel about it. And I want to fight for a world that anybody can essentially express themselves and be whatever they want to be within that society. In order to do that, we are going to have to get rid of the existing dictatorial order. Like, it's not a coming new world order. We already live in what I would describe as a new world. We've been living in it for 400 years under capitalism. I understand people don't agree with that, but that's how I see it. And as long as that dictatorship exists, all this stuff is going to seem and be, not just all this stuff is going to be used against us. Capitalists have used minorities to build empires for themselves. We can see how capitalists are using blacks and women's and even immigrants in some cases to push an agenda that is anti-immigrant, anti-black, or anti-white. It's anti-worker. And it has nothing to do with protecting those people. But in the name of defending those people, it pushes an agenda of the ruling class. And that's what I think is happening here with people who are expressing their own confusion, their own sense of, like, no, I don't feel like I'm a male. I feel more comfortable if I think of myself as a woman, and I actually want to change parts of myself to conform with that. I think that's fine if people want to do that. I do. I get there's a question of age, and maybe I'll come to that later in terms of if a 13 or 15-year-old said that they were going to do that, I'm questioning whether they should get a tattoo. I would say, are your parents comfortable with that? And that's as far as I'll go, at least currently. In terms of the state deciding, no, I don't think the state can say yes, or I don't think the state can say no, and I don't think the state can pull the parent out of the situation, because I think the state is an enemy to both the parent and the child and all of us. Do I agree with the parents' values in any one of these situations? No, but I would roughly, if a 12-year-old kid said they were getting a tattoo, I would probably say they might want to talk with their parent first.
How about if a 14-year-old wants to get a COVID jab and their parents are like, that's fine?
Well, if that's fine, then I think yes, they have to be. It's not fine in the context of it's an overall attack, but of course they can do that. Like, why not? Like, I don't agree with it. I wouldn't do it, but that, and particularly the big issue I have with that one is where the parents are kept out of the situation and they get that jab by a nurse at the school. That's where I go like, okay, that's fucked up.
That is happening with the hormones too.
But again, this question of you have to be clear, or I have to be clear. Just because I'm defaulting back to parents saying it, all that is saying is that this is a decision workers have to make for themselves. And a parental worker has, in my opinion, parental worker has more authority than the state in all these situations. And as it relates to their kids, they're going to have more say than I am as a teacher or as a friend to that child or whatever. And that's kind of how our society is organized. Will it be organized that in a free world? I don't know. And I'm open to other ways of people organizing themselves. But in this case, the state is always the enemy. And I do believe the state is weaponizing these ideas. But they've weaponized these ideas with other oppressed groups. And that does not change the fact that these folks experience oppression, and that part of fighting the system is going to be figuring out how to fight against all these oppressions and unite immigrants, blacks, women, gay people, people who identify as transvestites or transgender. I'm fine with that. I'm not as clear about which word, when it has to be used or can't be used. It does to me denote a person who is like really has felt like they've been told one thing about how they are and feel a different way. I, as a person, can relate to that because I've been told I'm a man, and I've been shamed for crying, shamed for being certain ways, shamed for wearing certain things. And there's other things I've been shamed for that I would change biologically if that would eliminate that shame. And so I understand that feeling. And so now, given the possibility, and of course there's an agenda behind those people creating that possibility, no doubt. And they are not free to just do whatever they want. But I do have to say, my fellow worker is free to fuck themselves as hard as they want underneath these folks until they start to figure out that we're going to have to unite to fight them. And that is part, to me, of liberty. Liberty and me fighting for freedom does mean I'm going to have to allow workers to fuck themselves with certain decisions they make if it turns out that they're falling for an agenda that does not serve their interests, whether that be a COVID shot or whether that be a pharmaceutical industry and medical industry that is looking to take advantage of your confusion and sense of identity confusion and looking to take advantage of that. I'm not going to just go invite those folks in, but I'm not going to stop them and say, no, you can't work with that doctor. You can't work with that hospital. I'm just going to tell them, you are letting the devil into your door, and if you think that they're going to help you, they are not. But for me, the issue of autonomy and people being able to choose what they do with their body, that's as far as I can go until we get rid of capitalism and talk about how all these oppressions, and I do describe this group, transgender, transsexual, as an oppressed group. All these oppressions are eradicated through the struggle of a system that produces those oppressions and then utilizes those oppressions very, very, very opportunistically to actually then push their agenda even harder. And they do it on all fields. They don't just do it with transgender. And that's why I don't feel a special threat from gender ideology, because I feel like what's going on in the transgender movement is no different than having this guy Austin being our defense director, and we're being told a black guy being the head of defense is somehow, progressive. And yet the U.S. is using that to launch its war into Ukraine and proxy war, blah, blah, blah. So that's my starting point.
The thing that you said about, there's been things that you've been made to feel ashamed of, dressing a certain way, crying, acting a certain way, whatever, and that you would change them, maybe in a, like, the problem to me is not you. The problem is like the society that makes people feel shame or makes them feel like they want to dissociate or be disembodied because of things like that, right? Like, I just don't understand the conclusion to go the other way. And you're saying, and of course, the ruling class weaponizes all of this stuff, right? Like, they weaponize everything they fucking can. But the way that you're describing a free society as a society in which men and women, like, it doesn't matter, it's free flowing, like, this is an irrelevant distinction. That's not a human society. Like, you are your sex. People will be able to dig up your bones in hundreds of years and be able to tell, was this a male or a female? Like, it's fundamental, and to say, like, even just, I don't think reproduction is what makes a woman, or it's not the only thing, right? But it is only women that can give birth, right? So you're not going to have a human society if you can't acknowledge that basic difference, right? That basic fact that we are a sexually dimorphic species. Otherwise, the only alternative, as I see it, would be transhumanism, if we can't acknowledge that distinction, right? And so to say, like, oh, I'm for humanity, but our sex doesn't matter, right? Like, that's how we come to be. That's how we come to exist. Like, all of us here, like, your mother birthed you, your mother birthed you, right? Everybody came from sex, right? And if we don't have that, like, it really is, like, it's transhumanism. And I just don't, I also don't, like, I guess the way Bilek puts this, to come back to the podcast episode that Eduardo was referencing earlier, like, this is why I think she refers to a lot of the transgender stuff as, like, colonization of human sex. And it is corporatism, and it is also medical industrial complex stuff. And that's another place where, like, I just don't see, bodily autonomy. I agree with you. People should be free to make whatever choices, mistakes, whatever. Like, amputate your arm if you want. Like, you're free. You're a free human. But I don't know. I've heard both of you be so critical of the medical industrial complex in all of these other scenarios. And yet here, like, I'm not saying that I know you guys aren't arguing for just, like, a free for all, like, here, just pass out the puberty blockers on the street and double mastectomies for all, but, like, your distinction is like, oh, you're not old enough. That's the distinction of, like, okay, well, then I'm fine with somebody butchering your perfectly healthy body, but do no harm with COVID jabs. There, we're going to hold doctors accountable. There, we're going to hold people accountable for the harm that they're causing. But we're all right with, I don't care, whatever, a 50-year-old with a surgeon, you know, chopping flesh out of somebody's forearm and grafting it into a faux penis and sewing it to their genital area. And that's like part of like liberation. I don't get it. Like, I don't get whatever you want to feel, identify, think, express, sure. But like, what are the consequences, or like what's how do we exist in a free society where that's happening?
Well, first off, we're not. I mean, when you say, well, then it's they can do this, they can do it, it's all fine. No, we live under a dictatorship. It's not fine. We live under tyranny, and so I will say that I'm not going to stop another worker from screwing themselves over. I might talk with them. I might argue with them. And if there's a struggle that we're engaged in against our enemies, our class enemies, and that worker takes the other side, then we got a problem. If that worker doesn't take our side, then I'm like, that's unfortunate. But if it takes the other side, it is a problem. But in the context of zero struggle, and in the context of none of this being freedom or liberty, because none of it is, whether you call yourself they, all these woke stuff that tries to simulate anti-racism or simulate progression along these questions, which actually it's literally just cosmetics in the context of all these things rolling backwards. People are more oppressed, people are more separated, more divided, more alienated, and part of that alienation is going to take its form in a kind of a gender confusion. No, it's not all fine. It's just that in the absence of any struggle, which there's no struggle, if a person said they want to take their COVID shot, I'm going to say, go take your COVID shot. I'm going to argue with you maybe if I care about you and if I think it's worth talking to you about it, but I'm not going to stop them. At the same time, I'm going to say the medical industry is completely fucked. It is part of that institution of capitalism, and all of it has to be broken and torn down. But right now, it looks like workers want shots. So that's unfortunate. And I would agree with you that it looks like it does appear, and that they are going to use these medical transformations to blur things over so that people don't necessarily know what it is to be man, what it is to be woman, what it is to be human. I can see how they can use that. I can see it. But that doesn't change the fact that I still would say the thing you said, you are your sex. I don't agree with that. I think sex is partly what determines who I am. I'm also my body. I'm also my thoughts. Those are not just aligned along something that people use to call me a male. And it's just that's a piece of it, an important piece. But by no way do I just think I'm identified or I'm defined, boxed in by a sex. I am in this society, and that's something. It's one of the reasons why I understand where transvestites come from, because I feel like I don't really know who I would have been if I didn't live in a society where that was gender obsessed. All right. It was gender obsessed when I was growing up in a particular way, and it has become newly gender obsessed in another way now. I can totally imagine living and growing in a society where gender didn't matter. I can completely imagine a human society, not transhuman, but a human society, a free society, where this question of gender wasn't that big a deal, and wasn't big in terms of because roles weren't that important. And I myself have felt confined by male and masculine roles. I have felt that it's actually stunted my development as a human. And I have felt that it's been part of my experience of a tyranny, because not the tyranny of women or men, tyranny of capitalism, but in the context of using gender roles to define what people can and can't be. So I don't agree.
Suddenly gone from sex to gender. Like, you're going back and forth between, okay, I want a society where sex isn't relevant, to I want a society where gender roles don't box me in. And of course, I can imagine a society where gender doesn't box us in as well. I don't even fucking know what gender means.
And I could imagine that I could imagine that somebody might say, I want to change my sex. And I'm like, that's fine. And what that might mean could be just dressing. It could be dressing and physical changes. I'm not going to have a problem with that. Now, does that not mean it's then weaponized by the medical industry and the capitalist system? It is. But if we don't have that, then I don't know what to call that. I don't know if I see that as some kind of potential, that's something that can be used to threaten all of us and threaten even humanity. I don't see that. I don't see it as a threat, but I do believe part of that is the fact that I more see us as all being workers, and that what unites us against a common enemy. And and Jessica, I think you come from the vantage point of that division of men and women as being more critical and crucial in defining how society is structured. And so I think that difference is shaping how we look at this issue, or one of the ways.
Is it, Jess? Is that what Andy just last said? Is it?
Yeah, but not from a desire to have men at war with women or to have some sort of hierarchical society. I'm just saying that our biological realities, as long as we are humans, are going to be relevant, and that in a healthy society, we acknowledge reality. So it's not that I want division and to say, oh, you're a female, so you have to go do this, and you're a male, so you can't be crying. I envision, a society where you don't feel that boxed in feeling that you're describing, Andy, because when you cry, people say, oh, he's crying, he's still a man. Or when someone says, a man says, yeah, I sleep with men, we say, awesome, you're still a man. And when a woman says, I don't want to have kids, or I want to wear pants, or whatever, we say, awesome, that's woman as well, right? Like, that's what I envision, which is basically a casting off of all gender roles. Because what is gender? Like, it's just a fucking set of stereotypes in the cultural ethos for the most part. I mean, there's different interpretations of it, and I know there's the sort of spiritual, like divine masculine, divine feminine, and I use those words too in some contexts. But in terms of like what we're talking about right here, it, like, even you take something like drag, right? Like, what is it? It is taking every every aesthetic stereotype, the makeup, the dresses, the 6-inch, 10-inch heels, the eyelashes, right? The uber sexualization and objectification, and like, I'm going to perform my sexuality for people to gaze upon, right? It's like every stereotype, times a billion. Like, it's all exaggerated, right? Like, the makeup is exaggerated, the hair is huge, right? It's like dressing up as a woman as if it's like a Halloween costume, right? And again, I don't care what people, but
right,
that's not what it is to be a woman, right? And I do want to press, just because the race thing has come up a couple times, like, what if I say to you guys, you know what? I have really done some work on myself, and I've been in counseling, and I've watched some YouTube videos, and I felt really uncomfortable in my body for a long time, and I have come to the realization that I am Black. And I want you guys to act as though I am an African American woman. Like, this is offensive, right? Everybody, like the left, would consider this beyond offensive, right? I mean, and
Rachel Doyle.
I'm going to be participating in trauma recovery groups for Black women, and I'm also going to apply for some African American scholarships. Right now, I'm like using really dark foundation, but I really like to get some skin transplant surgery. So maybe you could contribute to my Kickstarter, right? Like, because right now, our government's not very progressive, and health insurance doesn't cover this surgery that I want to get, right? This transracial surgery. Like this would be so fucking offensive, right? It's blackface. And this is why like I think Sheila Jeffries, I think she's the one who's attributed who came up with the phrase like woman face, this idea of like transgenderism as well, maybe not transgender, I guess transvestites and drag and the sort of aesthetic aspects of it as like woman face. Like what is the I mean, honestly, race is more of a spectrum than sex, right? If we're going to compare. But I'm really curious, like what, like, would that be different in your guys' mind if we introduced race instead of sex into the list of trans issues, just as a sort of thought project?
So I say I'm atheist agnostic because I don't really know where, like, I'm Mexican and grew up with curandismo and grew up with like superstitious things that I still sort of think maybe there are inexplicable things that happen, but I just don't believe God exists, like in the form the Christian Judeo view, or even the Muslim view, or even just like the Jewish or whatever, any religious sort of major religion view. Why am I saying this? Because I also can't deny that I also am influenced a lot by my Vipassana practice, which is a branch of Buddhism. And Buddhism is more of a philosophy than it is a religion, although I understand that it has converted into religion because a lot of people do have rituals and rites, and a lot of Asian cultures do have aesthetic or optically Buddhist rituals. And so I understand that it's become also a religion. Why is it important for me to say that? Because as a meditator, I'm not a monk, obviously, but as a lay person, I do, when I meditate and when I think about the world that we live in, I do think that there is something beyond race, something beyond gender, sex, our bodies, nationalities. There is something beyond just us, our identities. And I've only gotten to understand that through my experiential like meditation. And so even though I am proud Mexican, I would stand for not being Mexican, or I would stand for not being like what I would say even a brown person or a man or whatever. So I think that race, this is going to be, I guess I have a pass because I'm a person of color in the USA. I think race isn't actually, is for academic circles and liberal circles, I don't think it's I don't think race is an issue. I don't really think that race is or gender. I don't really think these things are what are as important to me as what human is to me. You know, that doesn't negate that I still think there are biological differences between men and women. There just are. It's clear. It's material. Yes, I still hold that, and I'm not going to buy into people saying, you know, well, there just aren't, and there are people who are. I don't know how there was some study, some university protests in Argentina where they were like not naming women. They were saying reproductive people or something like that. But I just don't. I'm not into that. I understand that there are differences. So I guess when you're saying that the transracial thing, I mean, as far as race, race isn't as. I don't really think there are biological differences in race. That's where I stand clear. I do think there are biological differences between men and women. So if someone would, I think it'd be silly though, because it's like, obviously you're not, but I'm not going to fight you on it. But I wouldn't, I don't think there are biological differences between you two as white people and me. Honestly, I just don't think so. I just think we are very much the same. And I know that racism exists even within people of color, as we already discussed. So for me, this post-trans, if someone wants to be transracial, I think they should just say like race isn't an issue for me, and that's not offensive to me as a person of color. But for them to just go and get aesthetically or surgical, and then to go join Black women's groups and all that, I think that is buying into what being transracial would mean, not doing that actually, because that would be buying into the identity politics, and that would be doing exactly what I think there are. Racism obviously exists, but I just I don't have an issue with people being beyond their race. And
right,
if
and the
people
ruling
want,
class
go
used
ahead.
has made up shit in this precise context. Like, I completely agree with you, Eduardo, in the sense that we've seen it flipped, and we've seen race, literally like science, science, right? It was not that long ago that what were they pushing? What was the ruling class and the scientific community pushing? Oh, Black people don't feel pain. They don't feel pain as much, right? So it's okay,
Right.
to torture slaves, right? Or they're not as intelligent, so they don't count as real humans, right? Like these fucking made up things, right? And I know, like, yeah, that probably plays into like what Andy's describing in terms of like corporate capture and stuff. But I do think it's the comparison is worth looking into. I think, if only because like there is a spectrum in terms of material reality when it comes to race, in a way that doesn't get talked about. Like we pretty much use black, white, maybe brown once in a while. When in reality, like if you actually look at cultures around the world, all kinds of different, colors and mixes and,
Especially Latinos.
yeah, we're human race, right?
Yeah.
To get a human, you need a female. You need a female. Like that's a real distinction.
Yeah. But what, I guess I have a question for you, Jess, that I still lingering in my head. I just as I keep repeating and making clear that I think there are biological differences between men and women, you're also making clear and emphasizing that you have no interest in mandating. And I agree with you. Like I'm not for mandating pronouns. And also you're as well as like you wouldn't mandate or legislate or anything around like people controlling people's desire to dress up or not, whether you agree with it or not. Like it's beyond like I understand that. For me, what you haven't touched on is uh, um, so I understand there's a corporate, even a pharmaceutical industrial complex like agenda to like monopolize this movement, and I get that. I do get that. Would you also agree though that just for conventional use, I'll say trans, but that or gender, whatever, but this issue of men, uh, according to that time period, dressing up as women, according to those norms at that time period, or women dressing up as men, that according to that time period, what that means to be a man, has always existed in history. Like that has always existed, right? We see it in Native American cultures. I talked about Inuits, fathers choosing the eldest daughter to marry another woman and to take on representatively a man's features.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to look into this more. I know there's an awesome woman named Kay Yang who is actually a former LGBTQ plus activist, kind of turned turf, I guess, who specifically does a lot of work on the like, what is it, two-spirit, gender, which I think is, maybe some of the examples you're thinking of fall into that. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure forever people have identified like across boundaries in myriad ways. I have not heard of an example of, an indigenous culture or a traditional or like tribal culture that, would chop off women's breasts because
right. And I was going to get there.
What you're talking, like, to use your word, like roles. Yeah. And to me, like, I mean, I don't know the specifics of like those particular, like what those cultural roles might be beyond what you've described here. But I mean, again, like we're kind of coming back to this idea of prescribed cultural activities, ways of dressing, aesthetics, expectations, right? Which are different than biology. Like they're different than male, female.
Yes.
And I would be curious, like, to look at some of those examples in more depth and see like what is the language that they use to describe those people, because my guess is that there was not this, even as they may have been like, okay, this, with the eldest example of the eldest daughter, like taking on a more like masculine role as prescribed by that society. I'd be curious, like, people don't actually think that that person was born male, right?
No, they know that they're
Right,
female,
right.
but they
Like,
have to choose. They have to choose the eldest to take on.
So they're not living in a in a psyop in the way that we are now, where like I literally walk into my classroom, and in some universities, like it is mandated that you have to have pronouns in your email description, and you have to participate, right? It's not enough to even just like stay silent. You have to actively participate in a false reality. Yeah.
Well, I invite people to look into it. I do think there's the Hejaras in India, there's the Mushas in Mexico, there are the Bardachis in northern U.S. America, and there are African tribes that had to marry women because of land, because men couldn't. Men were the only ones who could be property owners, and so women had to take on the role of a man to be able to do that. And then there's European, also cross-cultural, like throughout Europe, like lots of men that had to take on those roles as women. So this notion, or this idea of just this idea of a third gender, or another, something outside the binary role, has existed for a very long time. I don't doubt, from what Jennifer Bilek was sharing in her episode, which I again will link to the episode notes, is happening. I don't doubt that there is other things at play now, especially, I am glad you mentioned, because of capitalism. What I think, though, is the issue is religion in connection with capitalism, which is mostly Christian Judeo dictation of how we should live our lives. And so when I hear about this, it's like, this isn't new. This has only existed because Christian Judeo religion has dominated the world. So suddenly there's a pushback, there's a resistance. Like me being someone who I don't even want to label myself. I hate labeling myself, because I'll just, for conventional sake, I'll say pansexual. But I don't even like that word, because it's so, what is a pansexual? Do you know what I mean? Like, I just want to be known as Eduardo. And I've had relationships with men, I've had relationships with women, I've had relationships with trans, I've had relationships. I transcend. I'm in season when it feels like want to be with a man or a woman. It's like, to me, I've been a sex worker with married men and with married women, and it's just, to me, it's like beyond what I can even explain to people what I identify as. So when people say to me, like, well, when did all this like label begin? I think it's a backlash to all this capitalism and religion that has dominated the world. We wouldn't have these labels. We wouldn't have she, him, there, all these things, and them, and whatever. And we wouldn't have gay and lesbian and pansexual and asexual and demisexual and sapiosexual. We wouldn't have all of these things, I feel, if we just took away religion. Like, that's the issue, and capitalism. Like, these things go hand in hand. If we just didn't have these issues, it's like the word organic for me. It's like organic only came out of what happened, World War II, because of all the chemicals that they had to use. World War I, actually, because it started the chemicals way back. And so they had to find an identification to label what has not been used with chemicals. But before that, we never had the word organic. It was just apples and oranges, and we just ate, right? So I feel the reason why we have these labels today, and I'm not like, okay, I listen to my Gen Zer cousins and and nephews and stuff, and they'll talk about these labels and identify as this, identify as that, and it's like drives me mad. Like I can't keep up. Like today I'm blue. That's not an offense. I think I'm gonna edit that out. I'm not sure, but like the point is, or what was that, Jess? Where some people are identifying as kittens? They're saying in like Fox News.
People, I mean, there is a fetish. There's a whole category of porn for like amputees where people identify
Right.
as a three-limbed person and they I mean, it's not very many people, but like, are we just gonna go balls to the walls with this? I mean,
Well,
anyway, sorry, derailing.
but so what I mean is I just wish we went back to a time when it wasn't an issue. And I've said this with the Jake and Rob episode, with the what's right kind of episode, with people who are conservative and who are Trump voters. I said this: I don't make an issue of my race. Like, I really don't. It's other people who make an issue, and I have to talk about it. When I went down south to Texas, or when I go down to northern Florida, or when I'm in Idaho, like, I don't actually want to talk about my race. People talk about my race. And so they're making an issue of it, not I. So the same thing goes with like my sexuality. I really don't want to talk about it. I don't feel like I should. But people ask me, what do you identify as? And these are coming from mostly conservative people. They want to know. So I'm like, why is it an issue? So I wish we could go back to that time where, like, in history, it just people, or mostly throughout history, were not monogamous. People have not historically been monogamous people, and people have also historically not labeled themselves, and it wasn't an issue. It wasn't an issue if you were mushe. It wasn't an issue if you're hijara. And these played important parts and roles in culture and in society. And I think you're right. I do agree. Now that you gave me a little bit, you can stop. I was going to talk about the drag, but I think I talk too much and then we get lost. So why don't you respond, or Andy respond to what I say, and then I want to say about the drag. Maybe I'll just say quickly. Sorry, I do think you're right, Jess, about the drag thing. It is an objectification. I do feel it reflects the stereotypes that people, and especially in the left, say we shouldn't be stereotyping what women are like, and it does do that to a very exaggerated state. Go ahead, anyone.
I mean, I would have the same response kind of that I said to Andy, of like, I agree. I think you should have all of these amazing relationships, and people who want to have all of these crazy labels, go ahead. People do whatever they want, and still you're male, right? Like, that can include all of that. And I just wish we lived in a society where when somebody feels uncomfortable in their body, we don't like affirm and say like, oh, well, then we have to change it. Why is it not? Let's address that. Like, where is that coming from, right? And the example that gets thrown around a lot, and I think for good reason, is like, an anorexic, right, like, goes and says like, I feel like I'm really, really fat. We don't say like, oh, you feel fat, like, yeah, okay, then let's decrease your calorie load, and let's refer to you as overweight, right? Like, no, we see like, oh, okay, like, this person is out of touch with reality, right? And we get them mental health support, get them, we find ways to ground them, right? Like, ground them on earth in reality, get them to learn how to love themselves, right? Like, however they look, whoever they are attracted to, right? Like, that's the inclusion that I want. I don't want the inclusion of like, okay, well, let's medicate, let's disassociate, let's pathologize what it is to be human. Gosh, this is gonna be a long episode. At some point, I do want to touch on the homophobia thing, because I think it plays into a lot of what you said. But Andy, I think you were gonna jump in.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to get to everything today.
Probably not.
So like I was telling Eduardo, this could be an episode where we come back to round two, kind of thing.
In 2024.
No, that would be too long. Well, first off, I want to echo what Eduardo said about that. I had never really heard that point about what's the difference between the drag show exaggeration and blackface. I mean, I was thinking, well, blackface is clearly done to demean a particular group by a set of people who I look at them as bad, and so they're dressing up and making fun. I don't actually, since I'm not really from that drag community, so I don't know what its values are really about. But I could see from a woman's standpoint, feeling like, well, that doesn't look that too different. This looks pretty demeaning to me, given its exaggeration and the way it is. And I hadn't heard that point before, so that is interesting and helpful to think about that. I will say that, and also Eduardo, I definitely do see the problem with capitalism. I don't think of it as Christianity, even religion. I mean, organized religion, institutions of religion, the Catholic Church, the way that the church is set as part of an infrastructure of capitalism. Yes, that's a problem. But again, I put that under capitalism in the same way that the medical industry under capitalism. People who believe in God are going to be part, and believe in a religion or spirituality are going to be definitely be part of liberating society. And they're going to have, again, we're going to have differences, and that's going to have to be resolved.
I didn't go after people who believe in God.
Yeah. So I'm just saying, like, I don't see it as a Christian thing. I do see it as a capitalist thing. That might be the difference. And capitalism is perfectly willing to use Christianity and the Muslim religion, Islam, Judaism, Hinduism. It can use anything it wants to control people, and it takes off. It can use progressive ideology, and I agree with you, Jessica, that it is the idea that these that the pronouns or identifying a certain way, and then these various progressive covers that are given, particularly that we experience here in the Bay Area and in the United States, are literally the opposite. They are a kind of a tyranny of sorts, or certainly they are meant to both hide an oppression, and they are oppressive themselves. So there's nothing liberatory about that, where leftists demand, certain, like, you must say this or you must do this or else. The thing that I keep coming back to that's a difference for me is, and you kind of said it before when you said, hey, in a free society, you would cry, but you're a man. You would be reminded, oh, you're a man. And that label just doesn't, I have to say, that label, not only does it not matter to me, it feels threatening. Not like you're threatening me, but it feels like you're a person's trying to put me in a box. That is partly the way our society is constructed. So I go and I think to myself, if we had a revolution, if we had a free society, I don't know if there's a reason. I don't know if there's a reason to, that label has to have such meaning, like, oh, good, I'm a man, or oh, good, I'm a woman. Like, I kind of go back to where Eduardo's going to, which is more like, in the absence of a religious belief by myself, just having a soul, just having a me as a human, because I am. That's I guess what I would say I am, and as living, have a consciousness, and it has all sorts of possible expressions, and my actions I can do all sorts of actions, as long as I don't hurt somebody, as long as I'm not trying to, like, control somebody. I don't really see how it helps me to be told I'm a man if I happen to have a penis and if I happen to put out sperm and all that kind of stuff.
But it doesn't have to be good or bad, but it does have to be acknowledged.
I don't think it has to be acknowledged. I don't think it has to be. Is that gonna change whether or not I would have sex with a person who also has a penis versus whether I might have sex, or whether I choose to not do that at all, whether I not have sex at all, or whether I have sex with something else? Like, I don't think it doesn't have to be acknowledged. I think maybe for you, Jessica, it feels like it has to be, but it doesn't feel that way for me. And that's partly where my notion of a liberated society doesn't necessarily have to have those labels in them to have any real meaning, to have any more meaning than male, than anything else, like biped, 2 eyes. I don't know what needs to be acknowledged for me other than like I'm alive.
How are you gonna create a liberated society when like these material realities that are super relevant to our everyday lives, no matter what system we're under, or even if there's no system?
Whether I'm a male or whether I'm a female, it's also relevant of eating. It's also relevant of moving. It's also relevant of breathing and drinking. So the people who are ruling us are going to control those things. And I'm going to have to find other people who breathe and eat and move and who don't want those things constrained. And I'm going to have to work with them to figure out how we can take down the people who are trying to constrain that on us. That doesn't have to be a woman. It doesn't have to be a man. It doesn't have to be intersex. It means people who are experiencing their lives. I am experiencing a life as being a male, and it feels oppressive as a male, like in terms of constrained in terms of those roles. But there's other things that I do that are also being constrained, and I'm going to find other people who feel that same way. That's how I think we're going to have a revolution, and say, no, we're gonna actually liberate all this stuff for ourselves. So
you might be able to burn the system down with that, but what are you going to build if you can't acknowledge the basic distinction that?
But I don't see, that's the thing, is it isn't a basic distinction. It is a distinction, and you're the person who's maybe making that claim that it needs to be basic for me. It is for you, and as we go forward in our struggle, we'll see how it plays out. But you do have to understand, like, we have a different political lens that we look in terms of the world organized, and that is going to play a role into whether or not why you might see it as basic, and I don't see it so basic. And that's why another person, like, why I can also conceive of being comrades with a person who's like, I don't want any immigrant crossing this border, but I want to take down the fourth industrial revolution. There's a long conversation to have about what's this really going to look like? How are we going to make a revolution out of that? I think you would believe that unless I get clear on how basic and essential that question of male or female is, that I might not be able to fight for a revolution that liberates humanity. Currently, I don't see that. You know, like, we have our fellow comrade Jeff, who says, unless people get clear that there is that there's no virus in SARS-CoV-2, then you are going to get played over and over again. He's saying, look, until you get clear on that, you can't fight this. I don't actually agree with him on that, but I understand what he's saying. It's just, we're all kind of saying different things about what are the essential things you need to think in order to fight this system. I think we have some differences about what those things are.
Eduardo, go ahead.
Oh, I was thinking as I heard, I was listening to this again. We have to make this. I wrote some notes for next part 2. I was thinking, maybe, you know what I was thinking, Andy, that if we did, like, okay, theoretically, if we tore down the system and built a system, if you think about, like, how other areas like race, I don't believe there are biological differences between race. I do think there are biological differences between men and women. They're going to, when you're building a society, you do have to consider that there are different needs men and women have biologically. So I guess that's why I think there might be that basic acknowledgement to understand how what we do in relationship to our differences in biology might be needed to be acknowledged, just for the simple fact of having certain needs be met. Because you can't deny that, for example, if a woman is going through a menstrual period, that that it's going to have a different necessity or need be met than what a man goes through. If we have to, I don't know, build a home or build something, like, you're gonna have to pause that time for that woman because they're not able to work beyond what else is happening in their body, no? Or if you're pregnant, you're not gonna, like, I think that's what I think is maybe the acknowledgement, which is basic, that we're just biologically different in that sense. I don't think I don't think that in terms of leadership in any other area we're different. Go ahead.
I do think there's differences, but I would say that the degrees to which we are united in a common need to, again, eat, breathe, be free, those sorts of commonalities are much, much greater than some of the, what I would describe as differences that may be important, but I feel like are not essential for ultimately we working together to create a society that looks more like it takes care of our needs to eat, breathe, be free, be who we want to be, and that's a commonality. I mean, and what that would look like is not common between men, let alone between women and between women and men. That will have to be worked out through the course of building our world together. Like, and this is where I would say it will have to be about building before it's about burning, because if men and women work together to construct something under this tyranny that we live under, they will have to. Will that be something that provides them food and water, and doesn't force them into a war, or doesn't say gives them bodily autonomy and says you have to do this and this to your body, gives them body freedom and freedom of motion? To me, those are the much more those are across the board things that I think people would share in common. So what we have in common is much more than, I would say, than those differences that exist there. And any free society would have to figure out a whole menagerie of differences that exist, not just between men and women, but among men and among women, because there are going to be differences there, even about needs and things like that.
Well, yes. I guess here's why I think of it as like basic, because when I was in sex work, there's more mental energy that my coworkers who were women had to take on than what I had to take on. For example, if I got raped, I was just thinking about if I got raped. I didn't think about if I got pregnant. And that was different from my fellow coworker who was like constantly thinking like, oh shit, like if I get raped, I'm going to get pregnant. Additionally, I have to take care of that need, no? Or like if we were going to do sex work, like I could continue the following day, but if she had her menstrual period, she couldn't work because some men don't like to see blood coming out of a vagina and having that in their sex performance. You know, like they had to pause, so they couldn't get paid on time or whatever, or they had to pause for the period that they were. So I felt like there are things that I didn't experience that I had my fellow coworkers like that. Even though she got paid more than what I did, there were still hindrances because of their physicality. They couldn't control, their reproductive organ from like someone being inseminated forcefully to them, or their menstrual period monthly. And these things are just, I think that's when that came to my mind when Jess said basic. Like, I do think that there are basic differences that are going to affect you in this resistance, that you're going to have to mentally just take on a little bit more that is than what we might take on as men. No, that's what I think for me comes to mind. I was just thinking about specifically people in my head when I was working. So that's just to me like what come up to me.
Well, and too, you're not going to have a healthy society unless we support mothers, because otherwise,
there was the other thing.
I mean, if we have no mothers, we have no society, and I mean, it's just a reality. Like, they will birth the children, they will breastfeed the children in a healthy society, and I mean, all of us here, we came from our mothers, so that's what I kind of mean when I say basic, like literally, like origin, like you came from your mother. And so I think to deny that distinction between the sexes is just a recipe for a disembodied society.
I was born from my mother, but I was conceived between my father and my mother.
Right.
And if my dad wasn't around, I wouldn't exist. So I think the sex they had was a human activity. One of those people, the woman, was going to give birth to me. The other one was going to provide the sperm that would allow, the egg to join with the egg to produce the potential for a human. So I no more bias the idea of taking care of mothers than I do fathers. We're going to have to take care of mothers and fathers and boys and girls and intersex. I believe if that society doesn't, if it's not capable of taking care of those folks' needs and needs of food and shelter and liberty, then it's not a revolutionary society worth fighting for.
But those needs are different, though. Level of needs, I think.
Yeah.
I don't think there's I think they'll be different for some mothers, but I think even among a set of mothers, there's going to be differences, as there will be for a set of fathers. But to segment them off, father's needs over here and mother's needs over there, I don't think so. I actually think fathers and mothers are going to need freedom, food, air, water, peace, and that's what, and they're going to have to figure out how to do that together.
Right, but it's like for women. Go ahead.
Whether or not you want to acknowledge it or not, like just the example that Eduardo gave, which is basically like differences in hormones, right? Like males have basically like a 2-hour hormone cycle. We have a 28-day on average. Actually, I don't think that's correct. That's just like the stereotype. But, so we cannot acknowledge it, but it's going to affect every single one of those things that you said in terms of our daily lives and like how we act, how we relate to each other, our energy levels, our health, like all of it. And just the other thing I just kind of popped into my mind, which is kind of back on Eduardo's point, but also this idea of like origin, institutional religion actually has been has had a huge part in this psyop, in my opinion, in the sense that they, long before, drag queens and cross-sex hormones, pretty much every institutional religion made the creator male, right? Which is such a flip from reality, right? Like this idea that, some version of a dude, God, creator, whatever, that's like coded as masculine is just like such a testament to how upside down everything is, right? And there are, of course, like in a lot of indigenous communities, the creator's female, you have Sky Woman or whoever it may be, or the creatrix, right? But I think that's actually, now that I'm thinking about it, like that is super relevant to like creating this whole psyop that, that birth is something that can only happen, from a mother, from a female. And if we don't have the language to describe that, like not labels, but like if we don't have the language to describe reality, we're headed downhill, right? And we see that with this, it's woke and like trendy and whatever, birthing person and they and all of it, right? People with cervixes, all this kind of stuff, chest feeding. But it's a slippery slope. And I think we're down it already. Man, there's so much else I wanted to bring up, but maybe we'll do part 2.
We have to do part 2.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
So what do you think, Eduardo? Did we get through this?
I think yes, it was a, I'd have to look at it. It was a lot covered. And we have to do part 2.
And Jess, do you feel like you spoke more of your thoughts
authentically?
Yeah, I'm not trying. I was not being authentic before.
No, but maybe you.
I think I was just like, But yeah, no, I think it was good. I don't know. We'll see. I'll watch it back on the edit.
I'm glad you're willing to do it, because I actually think it's important for people to hear the kind of different kind of cycles we went through in this discussion.
You probably would be too, Andy, no? Like, even just being adjacent.
Yes.
Turf adjacent.
We're not calling you out as a trans hating blah 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 or something. Like, I'm giving you I'm platforming a hate person like yourself.
Yeah.
No,
they can
but
fuck off.
Do you have to do pronouns in your job? Like, do you have to go on the first day or whatever?
It was more an issue at my last school.
Yeah.
To be honest. And you're right. I actually would have liked this episode to come up, to be at Mission still, like, so I could be there so people could really just go nuts with it. Actually, at my new school, it doesn't get talked about as much. I also think the fact that it's middle schoolers, like this kind of stuff is happening more at that 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th grade thing going on.
You're not seeing like a whole lot of.
I am not seeing a lot of that in middle school, at least at my middle school. I was seeing, you are right, I was seeing more and more of it developing at high school. And it is, I used to see it as exclusively liberatory, an expression of people like freeing themselves. And now I'm of two minds. Like, I go, oh, this is also something pernicious. While at the same time, I do want people to be able to be who they want to be. I know you do too as well. So that's the tension I was in. The push, what I would have described what seems like a push from below for freedom, being captured now by people who are looking to make you trapped.
Yeah. Well, I have more to say, but I'll say next time.
And Andy, lastly, I was going to say, this is the last thing. I was to say, there are some women that went after you in the socialist circles you were in ISO. Do you remember that? And I was thinking as you were talking, Jesus, the way that you were talking, if they don't watch this entire video in context, it's as if you just don't, like, I could see some of the women coming back after you. That's the reason why the ISO is fucked, because you didn't consider those basic differences.
Right.
And that's
sexist.
Something. But I know you were not participating. Yeah, there was a lot that happened that you were not a participation of, but the exploitation of women in the ISO that I actually challenged you on in an episode before. I could see how people could think that you were like covering or maybe just wanting to just staying out of it. It's like a complacent to it. Do you know what I mean?
Yep.
So I was thinking you could get canceled and forever canceled, Andy, as well.
I don't think many of those people look at these episodes any longer.
All right. Let's conclude. Well, before I conclude, I just want to say, for this part, Jason, so we'll do part 2 of this discussion. I think I didn't expect this discussion to go the way it did, and it is. There's a lot that I'm also like sorting out in this discussion, and I appreciate the bravery of Jess, of Andy, and I'm constantly looking for courage within me to have these challenging discussions, as I first remember we did with the Identity Politics episode a long time ago when we started What's Left. So that's what we are about here on What's Left, right? To have those challenging conversations that are not normally discussed in other political forums. No pun intended, in binary kind of political left versus right kind of paradigm ways of thinking. So we'll do part 2 and we'll see what comes out of that. There's a lot to uncover: population control, homophobia, colonization versus exploitation, and I also was going to discuss about the issue around minors. I didn't get a chance to discuss that part, but and then Jess also had some ideas. So we'll do part 2, and people should definitely check out the links in the episode notes about the 2 resources that Jess shared with me in our group as well. I think I remember now, but that I think will also be more of an understanding of what we were talking about in this episode. Right. Well, that does it for this week's episode. What's Left is a weekly political podcast channel challenging the mainstream left. We post information about our topics and our guests on the episode notes where you found this episode. You can find past episodes to this podcast /channel there and connect with us. I remind folks, if you like anything I've heard here, please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications to any of our platforms, excuse me, on Spotify, iTunes Podcast, Stitcher, Google Play, BitChute, Odyssey, YouTube, Rumble, or Telegram. And you can find our blog and any of those links in the episode notes where we found this episode. If you would like to give us feedback about something you've heard or suggest something for us to cover, contact us through our blog. And we'll check you all next time. I'm Eduardo Huerca with co-hosts Jessica and Andy Lipson, and Kenny will be back with us when he's done with his sabbatical. And thank you for listening. Ciao.